Welcome back to episode 4, where we break back into the LA poker scene with a visit to Commerce Casino to finally get a session of 510 on the vlog. I know I've been talking about this for some time now, and I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to get back into the mix and battle it out with some of the regulars here. Walking into Commerce definitely brings back some memories. The gaming floor hasn't changed one bit, and the chandeliers bring back nostalgia of this place. It would have been a great opportunity to have remodeled the poker floor during the last year to keep up with other LA casinos like Gardens, Hustler, or Hollywood Park, but it serves its purpose. The hotel facilities were remodeled just a few years ago and are kept pretty nice. But I've always wondered, outside of the casino goers, what are some of the other reasons guests would opt to stay at the hotel? We're immediately sat into the 515 game and buy in for the max of 1500. On the Bravo Poker mobile app, this is designated as the 500 to 1500 game and indicates the buy-in amount and not necessarily the blinds. It can be confusing looking at the list, so if you're planning your first visit, here is a quick reference table. If any of these are incorrect, comment below and let me know. I also feel like it's important to note the rake structure in LA as it's more aggressive than most other locations. It's technically not a rake, but referred to as a drop. The drop is $5 for the house, plus a $1 bad beat jackpot immediately taken once the flop is dealt. There's also another dollar taken on any river dealt for a total of $7. It's just the cost of playing poker in LA, and while it might have some unusual effects on the game longer term, it's just something to note up front so you're not shell-shocked when visiting. It's time to get into some hands. In early trading, we find ace-king under the gun and open to 35. 35? The player to my left and the small blind calls. I'm unknown to everyone at the table, but from my short time there, I learned that both opponents are waiting for their typical 10-20 game to start up. The flop is king 8-4 with 2 hearts. The small blind checks, and here I take a questionable line of checking to the person on my left. I do this for a few reasons, and looking back at it, I don't think it was really necessary as I don't plan on becoming a reg here. Anyhow, the turn is a 9 of clubs, which is a neutral card. It doesn't complete any mate draws, but it does add a few additional straight and flush draws. The small blind now bets 70, and to keep game flow here, I decide to call this time and evaluate the river. The river brings the king of hearts, which completes the front door flush, while improving my hand as well. The small blind now bets out 165, and I'm all over the options here. Folding isn't 100% out of the question for your typical 5-10 player, though for this specific opponent, the merits really are focused between calling and raising. Calling here is a safe play, and raising could expose myself to getting blown off my hand. After some deliberation, I opt to call, and the small blind proudly flips over queen 10 of clubs for a misdraw. A friend of mine used to run a poker stable in LA. He and I had some contrarian thoughts behind how to best print money at the tables. Without getting too much into the weeds, I always thought a well-rounded pro should incorporate the fundamentals with exploitative theory. With that in mind, in this next hand, the under-the-gun player just lost a larger sized pot on a misdraw. This player had murmured something along the lines of, "What the fucking hell, I had every draw and I keep fucking missing. I hate this fucking game, I'm so fucking unlucky. Frank. I guess you had to be there to capture this sense of frustration. If you ever find yourself in a similar situation, frazzled, frustrated, and on tilt, I highly recommend stepping away from the table and taking a breather to collect your thoughts and regain focus. It'll help you get back on your A game. Back to the hand, the under-the-gun player limps for 10, and it folds to me with king-jack on the button, which is good for a raise to 40. Normally after one limper, this is probably 45 or 50 at these depths, but with the blind still left to act, I felt that this was the best way to leverage the formation to exert pressure on the blinds while keeping it friendly enough to solicit a call with the under-the-gun player. Both the big blind and small blind fold and the under-the-gun calls. The flop is ace-king-10 with 2 diamonds, and when he checks, he inadvertently signals that he had whiffed the flop. I proceed to reach for chips, and he folds before I get my $50 bet out. While these types of small pot situations may seem insignificant, they add up over time, and besides, who doesn't like winning uncontested pots? Now the player to our left calls it quits, and we move over to get a better angle of the table. In this next hand, we start off with a limp under the gun, followed by the cutoff and button limping. We have king-jack in the small blind, and we complete for 5, and the big blind checks his option. We're 5 ways to the flop of Jack 8-4. Action checks to the button, who bets 35. I call 35, and both the big blind and under the gun calls as well. The turn brings another 4, and it checks around. The river is the ace of diamonds, and now the big blind leads for 95. Both under the gun and button fold, and now we have a curious spot here. This bet on the river by the big blind just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. He doesn't rip much here at all except for a slow played 4, and based off his playstyle, I just didn't see him slow playing a 4 on the turn. It would also be weird to have him show up with an ace here, so when things don't make sense, I tend to lean towards calling. The big blind shows Queen 8 of hearts, and we take this one down. The very next hand is already in progress, and it was a bit of a punt to be honest. I have aces under the gun, and I raise to 35. My neighbor to the left, and the button calls. The flop comes King 8-6, and when I bet 55, the player to my left puts in a raise to 165. I'm not folding here to someone who might be tilting from the last hand for a single raise. The turn is the Jack of Hearts, and I check call a bet of 225. The river is the King of Diamonds, and I think this is where things go off the rails. I check, and now he bets 450, and under normal circumstances, this is just an obvious fold for many reasons. However, I felt like tilt might have been a part of the equation here, so I finally talked myself into a call. Well, you probably know what was coming next. He had made a full house with King 6 offsuit, so I guess the silver lining is that I was right he was on tilt, but I was dead wrong with his holding. I guess I really need to up my blocking game. This is the second hand in a row where I wasn't able to capture the preflop action. This hand happens right after the disaster you just witnessed, and I'm on the button with the good old suited ace. Action folds to me, and I open to 35. I would classify this as your typical button open situation. Well, anyways, the small blind folds, and the big blind calls. What was not so typical was flopping the joint. The big blind checks, and I continue for 30. And he calls pretty quickly. The turn is the deuce of clubs, and he checks again, and this time I size up to 85, which he calls again without much hesitation. At this point, he's called down 2 streets while I hold the nut blocker, so I think it's pretty safe to assume that he at least has a minimum of a value hand such as top pair here. The river is a clean looking 3 of diamonds. Clean for him, as there are no additional spades, and clean for me because the board didn't pair. This time when he checks, I decide to size up to 250, which is around 80% of the pot. This is your classic nuts versus air kind of situation. I've 3-barreled this hand, which is an indication of either immense strength, or a situation where I have something like ace-king with the ace of spades. It's still a hand with great equity to barrel down on a monotone flop, and sometimes turn into a river bluff. This time, after some deliberation, he calls and sees the bad news. In this next hand, unfortunately I don't have any footage, so we'll be reviewing my notes. The under the gun limps, while the hijack and button also limp to the small blind, who raises to $25. That's right, a $25 raise from the small blind after 3 limpers in a 5-10 game. I mean, I'm not exactly sure what's going on here, but we're definitely not on board with playing a $25 5-way game of bingo with queens. I raised to 115, and only the small blind calls. You could say that the flop was, what's that word? Oh yeah, horrible. Horrible for my hand. That's the word. The small blind checks, and I check right behind. The turn is a 9, and now the small blind leads out for 165. And at this point, there's not a whole lot of clarity on the opponent's hand. What I know about this opponent, he's not really betting a king like this here, so that leaves pocket pairs and some suited ace holdings. In the moment, I decided not to fold and evaluate the river action. The river is what you would call, darn, what's that word again? Oh, that's right, favorable. The river was very favorable. It was a queen. It's somewhat bittersweet though, as now the small blind checks. On the infinitesimally small chance he has something like ace king here, he's never checking the river, and I block ace queen. I eventually opt for a sizing of 250 to get crying calls out of ace x holdings and possibly something like pocket jacks. The small blind eventually calls, and we're good against ace-jack. This next hand describes a playstyle I'm sure everyone watching this video has experienced at one point or another, whether on the giving or receiving side, and that's someone who decides to limp shove. An early position player limps in for 10, along with two others before it gets to me in the small blind when I look down at pocket kings. I raise to 65 here, and it folds back to the initial limper, who decides $65 just isn't enough, and decides to shove all in for roughly 400. If he has aces here, I suppose it's just your typical cooler, but for around 40 big blinds, I'm never folding here. The board runs out queen, 10, 9, 6, 4, and the opponent shows ace king. Time to pack it up and get out of here. Thanks again for joining me on another poker vlog. If you've made it this far, please do not forget to like and subscribe to this channel so you don't miss any future videos. It helps the channel with the YouTube algorithms and helps motivate me whenever I see positive numbers indicating more of you out there enjoying the content. Here are the results from our session today. In for 1500, out for 2711. In episode 5, we'll be taking a trip down to the Garden Casino for the very first time to see what all the hype is about. It's going to be one heck of a session, so stay tuned. Take care of yourselves, stay safe, and see you next time.